Hello, this is Louis Paul. This is The Colors of Prague. This is season 5, episode 11. I'm calling this one Revisiting Procol Harum. Now, Procol Harum were one of the key influential progressive rock bands of the 60s and 70s, and their name often appears in discussions of are they or aren't they Prague? Well, of course they are, and they have a heavy classical music bent, which so many of the best early progressive bands did. So members of Procol Harum date back as early as 1959 in a band called the Paramounts, playing early rock and roll music, mostly cover songs. The Paramounts split in 66, but singer keyboard player Gary Brooker met poet lyricist Keith Reid, R-E-I-D, and they began writing songs. And they went back to the original members of the Paramounts, and Procol Harum was born. Now they went back to the original members of the band uh, to fill out this band. Procol Harum featured Brooker on vocals and piano, Matthew Fisher on Hammond organ, Hendrix Fan, Robin Trower on guitar, David Knight on bass, and B.J. Barry James Wilson on drums. While a different guitar player and two drummers were employed for the sessions, released decades later as alternate tracks, the sessions for the first album, um, the members I just mentioned became the core band, at least for the first albums. Procol Harum, the album, was released as A Wider Shade of Pale and was first released in England in 67. It was called A Wider Shade of Pale in the US, named after the well-received single, which was released in the UK. Now, while the running order for the North American release was resequenced, adding in A Wider Shade of Pale, remember, it was a UK single. It actually wasn't on the first Procol Harum album released in the UK, but because it was a very popular and good-selling single, they added it into the album and retitled the album Wider Shade of Pale for the US. They did remove a short, jokey song called Good Captain Clack, sort of like a oddball Monty Python-esque ditty, which was fine. The band was a bit of a hit with the psychedelic crowd, who liked the slow, funereal-paced arrangements, sometimes verging on the blues, but not quite. And there were some slow-down classical-style arrangements. Very unique sound they had. The combination of piano and Hammond organ was definitely a different sound, as opposed to most of the psychedelic bands at the time were more heavily uh, slower, but blues rock, uh, heavy on the guitar side of music. It's not to say that there's some psychedelic guitar in early Procol Harum music, courtesy of Robin Trower's electric guitar. And then, as is now, Brooker's, well, as of recent, Brooker's deep sing-song voice came across as someone reciting poetry verse to music. And that's pretty much what it was, because Keith Reid was a writer who wrote uh, verse and lyrics, and Brooker, at first, transcribed that to music, and there were the songs. Funny thing was, I always remembered A Wider Shade of Pale as being a long, epic song, but I guess it wasn't. It's really just 4 minutes long. Although they did longer versions uh, that were released as alternate tracks years later. But those didn't see release for a long time. So what appeared to be in recollection this really long song, I'm thinking 6, 7 minutes, if not more, was just a 4 minute single, which is interesting. Others might I have share the same misthought. Also on the debut is Conquistador and Repent While Purges, which is a deep cut for sure. While these were while there were re-releases during the early days of CDs, Esoteric from the UK released a 2-disc remastered version um, with first on disc 1 the original UK pressing song listing, followed by some singles and B-sides and alternate mixes and some mono mixes. First thing that is apparent is the guitarist moved way more to the forefront of the UK remixes, followed by the Hammond and bass. And the funny thing is, the bass player pretty much, in retrospect, I mean, who was thinking of this then, uh, played in descending style, which adding again to the unusual sound of Procol Harum. Disc 2 of the Esoteric set has some previously unreleased and extended versions. We have Wider Shade, Conquistador, Repent While Purchased, and of course, it's topped off with 3 live tracks from the BBC Easy Beat program from June 1967, and 4 from BBC's well-known Top Gear, and that was a performance they did in the BBC in September 1967. Shine On Brightly, released in 68, is definitely a Procol Harum recording for the prog lovers out there. Of course, its radio-friendly hit is the title track, Shine On Brightly, which recalls Wider Shade of Pale, but maybe perhaps intentionally. The trump card here is one, if not the first appearances of a prog epic length song in the nearly 18-minute In Hell 'Twas I. This comes in 5 sections, so it's a progressive rock suite. Few bands attempt this song in completion. One of the more recent ones, surprisingly, was Transatlantic, the international supergroup featuring members of the Flower Kings, Neil Morse, etc. But this, In Hell 'Twas I, from Shine On Brightly, actually predates anything Yes Would Do a few years later by doing a sectioned long song, multi-sections, a suite, let's call it. Esoteric also released a 3-disc special edition of this, also in 2015, as like they did the debut I just discussed. Disc 1 features the stereo mix, followed by Disc 2's remastered mono mix. Disc 3 features recordings for this album done at Advision and Olympic Studios. And they probably sound the rehearsal tapes. So it just sounds like the band is trying to get the song down. Pretty good for Procol Harum collectors. It's a nice thing to hear, and these are affordable sets. It's not a break the bank kind of thing. Disc 3 is one of the weaker ones. It's a hodgepodge of more of the same, some backing tracks without vocals, and only 3 BBC radio live tracks. And unfortunately, last 2 parts of In Hell 'Twas I, which they recorded for the BBC live, was a live appearance, and I guess they didn't have the time, or they couldn't attempt that whole 18-minute song live, so they just did two sections of it. A Salty Dog was released in 1969 and is the last of the Procol Harum recordings with the classic lineup. It's also a different sounding band than we were used to. More of the supporting members take turns at the vocals. There's calypso influence in a few of the songs. This has also a much looser feel to the band. The only tune that even resembles the sound of Procol Harum on the first two albums uh, appears barely on the A Salty Dog, which is the title track. The rest is kind of chaotic, actually. The 2015, again, Esoteric remaster is the best sounding of the first three albums out there, be that as it may. And the immediate thought that came to my mind was listening to this after so long, it's like that many British bands, Procol Harum wanted to be like the American Canadian band, The Band, Robbie Robertson, Levon Helm, etc. And not just any band, but they were listening to and probably influenced by the music the band was putting out at that time. Everyone knows famously the band worked with Dylan on and off and Robbie Robertson on and off throughout the years. Disc 1 of the Esoteric set is an excellent sounding remaster of the original A Salty Dog, while Disc 2 disappoints as it's just odds and ends material and alternate tracks of the same songs. By the time of Home in 1970, Matthew Fisher had left. Apparently, so had lyricist Keith Reed. But how sustainable a band is this when you have some major figures leaving? Now, the band was very popular, and I'm musically and commercially, and I'm quite sure management, and more likely Brooker as well, decided they could write their own songs. Now, on this album, Whiskey Train and Wailing Stories are about the only two good songs on there. The album was called Home. And the thing that was really interesting was they were in the style of Procol Harum, and probably, one could say quite successfully mimicked that Procol Harum sound from these first three albums, but the rest was not so great. Of course, live in concert with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra, which was released in 1972, was among the first rock band working with an orchestra albums out there. Now, everyone knows hard rockers Deep Purple would also try this out, and so did a few other bands with various degrees of success, just say. Only Brooker and Wilson remained from the original lineup at this time, but most of the material is from the first three albums. Procol Harum, or rather Gary Brooker, and bandmates continued on and off for a number of years. The last official Procol Harum release was 2017's Novum, Novum, with lyrics written by, are you ready, Pete Brown of Cream fame. Now, as a solo artist, Gary Brooker joined the recording sessions for George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. I didn't know that, and I went back to, yes, it's true. And he toured as a member of Ringo Starr's All-Star Band in 97 and 99. And I remember seeing that. He was in the Alan Parker film version of Evita. Did you know that? He's seen on screen, especially with Antonio Banderas performing Rainbow Song. So you Procol Harum fans may want to check Evita out. It's not a terrible film. It's worth watching. Um, uh, a series of falls led to Brooker being out of the limelight, and he often appeared with his head bandaged in a few of the later period shows, which I thought interesting. Um, the final Procol Harum in name-only shows um, sometimes featured a head bandaged Gary Brooker at the keyboards. He succumbed to cancer in 2022 at age 76. Matthew Fisher, the Hammond organ player who left Procol Harum, actually twice, he rejoined the band in the reduced role as a session player. And when he left finally, he complained publicly that the band members were not receiving equal amounts of pay. And Brooker was claiming the Procol Harum name pretty much for himself. This is what I've read, so be that as it may. Now, Matthew Fisher went on to become an in-house producer for CBS Records, and interesting, he produced Robin Trower's Bridge of Sighs and For Earth Below. To Rolling Stone, a blues stomper filled with Hendrix-like arpeggios from Bridge of Sighs, released in 1974, was an early classic rock staple for years and remains so. And it remains also Robin Trower's most well-known solo recording. A 2023 comeback recorded with a local New York female blues singer failed to go anywhere. And they planned for a 2024 tour, which was canceled due to Robin Trower's health reasons. That's all I know about that. So, in a nutshell, that was our show. I revisited some early Procol Harum albums and gave you probably some information you didn't know about the band members. Thanks for watching. We'll be back soon.